This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. English is a subject that everybody knows because you are studying in schools, you speak the language, etc., etc. However, I don't think that most people understand that English scholars do a lot of different things than just teaching English. And that's why we are here today to talk to Dr. Hentzi, with whom we're going to have a conversation about these and other issues. Dr. Hentzi is a native of Waterbury, Connecticut. He obtained his bachelor's degree from Oberlin College in Ohio, and both his master's and doctorate in English from the Columbia University in New York City. And today he's an associate professor in the Department of English and an associate dean at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to our show, College Talk.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. The first question that occurs to me is, why do you become an English professor? What was the motivation for you to get into this field?
I guess I always knew that I was interested in the arts and culture. I started more interested in music than anything else when I was quite young, but it quickly branched into an interest in literature. And so from very early on, I was looking for a way to make a career that would allow me to pursue those kinds of interests generally, and then as I went along, the interest in literature specifically. So by about the middle of my undergraduate career, I was pretty sure I had settled on English and English literature.
Okay. Well, one of the authors that you have studied is Daniel Defoe, which is in a way connected to the kind of introduction that I made to this show, because although everybody knows him as the author of Robinson Crusoe, he was also a journalist, a trader, a pamphleteer, even a spy. And I was wondering if you can tell our audience who was this guy besides this author of this famous novel.
Well, I'm not sure I know definitively because he did a lot of things, as you say, and in fact, there's even a lot of controversy about whether he wrote all the things that he was said to have written. At one point, there was a catalog of his works that was very long, and ever since then, scholars have been disputing how much of it he actually wrote and whether some of it was attributed to him mistakenly. So in a sense, we only have the documents to go on, and we don't even know exactly with any great sense of security how many of them were written by him. But he was all of those things that you mentioned, including a businessman, and only after he was 50 years old did he begin writing the novels we mostly remember him for nowadays.
Yeah. Now, there is also some discussion whether or not he can be considered one of the founders of the novel as a genre in English literature. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it absolutely depends on how you define the novel and its history. I mean, there are long prose fictions throughout Western history going back to the Greek and Roman world. And one school of thought has it that those are all, in some sense, novels, or it's all part of a continuous history. And from that point of view, Defoe comes pretty late in a long, long history. But many other people, and I'm one of them, feel that things changed in certain identifiable ways in the late 17th century, the early 18th century, that the kind of prose fiction that comes to the fore at that time is different in certain ways from the earlier long prose narratives. And from that point of view, Defoe certainly is one of the founders. Just in the sense that his books are among the prose narratives from that period that continue to interest us, especially in retrospect, when we've got, another almost 300 years of the novel following that. Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about his most famous masterpiece, Robinson Crusoe, some people today consider that to be kind of a juvenile literature. But don't you think that is kind of an unfair labeling on that particular piece? Because although we know that a lot of people in their youth like Robinson Crusoe, to read Robinson Crusoe, I'm not sure that that's a fair way to put things in these kind of boxes.
Well, I think it's definitely much more than that. I don't know. There really are not that many other works of literature, canonical works that continue to be studied in universities, that just about everybody knows. You know, they may not remember or may not know that it was written by Daniel Defoe. They may not even remember the title, but the situation of the man marooned on a desert island who has to fend for himself, who has to, in a sense, construct his own world, is so resonant that it's taken many, many other forms in the culture, you know, and children's books are just one of them. It's you know, quite a job just to enumerate all the different versions of Robinson Crusoe that are out there, including sequels written by Defoe himself, and they were just the first of many other adaptations, which continue right down to the modern, and right down to our own day. You know, we have men marooned on planets, for example. It's the same theme. Matt Damon was Robinson Crusoe,
yes.
most recently.
Yes.
I think, yeah.
Okay. Now, talking about classics in literature, sometimes I have heard, not very frequently, but from time to time, some English professors that say that you can graduate and have a good understanding of English, so it's an undergraduate degree in English, without having to read Shakespeare. And I wanted to hear your take on that. I'm sure you have heard something along those lines.
I mean, people will argue anything, I think. I suppose I'm fairly traditional. I think if you're getting a degree in English literature and you somehow manage to avoid the dominant poet in the language, that I would say something is lacking in your education.
Yeah. No, and besides that, I mean, the richness that is in Shakespeare's writing, when one thing about this famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. Every phrase there contains so much meaning. Like, for example, when he says the lost delay, well, that's what we're seeing today in the judiciary system, that any minuscule case can take even years to go through.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's not only about literature itself, it's about the meaning and what is behind that.
Well, of course. I mean, I think that's exactly where I begin with Shakespeare. I mean, just the sheer richness of the language is really unparalleled. And then there are so many other dimensions to Shakespeare beyond that. And first of all, I don't consider myself any great Shakespearean, but my life would be a lot poorer if I had never read Shakespeare. I'll just say that.
Well, welcome to the club. Yeah. Now, you have also written about many other things, especially things that have to do with film, with cinema. And I remember reading about a work that you authored. The title was Little Cinema of Horrors, which I guess is a parody of the Little
Shop of Horrors.
Shop of Horrors.
Yeah.
What was that work all about?
That was a short essay on what's really a subcultural phenomenon. You know, the cult of watching bad films as a kind of camp experience. And it's just a short essay that I did, although oddly enough it got picked up and reprinted, and you never know what's gonna have an afterlife. But I was interested in this because I think it's something that a lot of people of my generation and beyond did, was to watch really lousy films for fun and comment on them and treat them as sort of camp experiences. Then I found out that there's a whole culture around this, and I was interested in that culture because, like a lot of other subcultures, it's a kind of alternative to the dominant culture, and it expresses forms of resistance to the norms of the dominant culture, and that's what I was writing about there.
That's what some people call cult movies, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And we know many examples of that. The Blues Brothers, for example, is not a cinematic masterpiece, but there's a cult following for that particular movie.
Yeah. And, you know, part of it is dredging up old films that are particularly awful in some way, but at the same time charming, or looking at films made by people who just really didn't have the money to make a film that would meet Hollywood standards. And you can see that in the film, even though the earnestness of it, or even just sometimes the crazy creativity of it, is appealing in its own way.
And I think probably the pinnacle of that era is in the 50s and 60s with all those B movies or science fiction movies of these aliens that were invading us and all these monsters. You could see immediately they were made out of rubber or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorites from that era is a film called The Killer Shrews, where there's these giant shrews were actually played by dogs with throw rugs over their backs and fake fangs and things like that. Yeah, that are just have a kind of charm in their own right.
Well, and talk about killing things. That reminds me of the famous movie, The Attack of the Killing Tomatoes.
Yeah.
What can be scary about a tomato?
Yeah. Right.
But still, somehow that and that also tells us a lot about the culture, what was going on in this country at that time with the Red Menace and the Cold War and all that sort of things. And I think some people don't realize that by looking at those movies, we can travel to the past. And if you get things into context, you can fully understand what's going on.
Right. Well, there's a whole subgenre of those B sci-fi films that are kind of documents of the psychology of the era, right? The kind of paranoia and worries about nuclear holocaust and so forth. And that's it's in some ways even a more serious phenomenon.
Yeah. Now that we're talking about film and also literature, some people criticize movies that are adaptations from great works, saying this is a disservice, this is not the whole story. Other people say, no, but this could be a way to interest people in the original book. What do you think about that?
Well, I think anytime you make, let's say, be grand and say a work of art that refers to another work of art of particular distinction, you set yourself up for possible criticism. I would never say don't do it. It's always interesting to see what somebody does with a work that's well known. It's in some ways it's always inevitably a kind of homage to the earlier work, even if it's critical of that earlier work, because it says that the influence of that work is still there. Sometimes, of course, they're just bad, and they don't live up to the earlier work at all. But other times they make very interesting comparisons. They create very interesting comparisons between different approaches and also whole different eras. One of the pieces I wrote is not about a great work of literature, but it was a work of literature that was made into a movie, a novel by the Scottish writer Alexander Chalky. And he's a countercultural figure who wrote during the 50s, and his one of his novels, Young Adam, was made into a film about 50 years later in the early 2000s. And what interested me there was that the film was very faithful to the novel. It reproduced the narrative almost exactly, and yet the differences between the two were significant. It really wasn't a question of better or worse, but what interested me was the way that even though the film was faithful to the novel, the comparison was a display of historical differences, cultural differences.
The other thing I think some people don't understand is that films use a different language than just words.
Sure.
You can say a lot of things that are written in the novel just with a few images that takes you through the whole idea of what happened between A and B. And that's why some of the films are pretty much short of words, because they have the ability to say all these kind of things just with a few images.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think... one of the things that's always been important to me, whether I'm studying film or literature or analyzing film or literature, I've always tried to do two things which are very difficult to do together. On the one hand, to respect the fact that all works of art are produced at a particular historical moment within a particular culture, and that in some sense they have a relationship to that culture. They don't just jump out as timeless masterpieces. They're connected to the time and place that produced them in some way, even though they may live well beyond it. But at the same time, I'm not a historian. I'm a literary critic or a critic of film and media, and I want to respect the texts in their own right, which means to read them closely. I mean, to my mind, the great achievement of literary criticism in the last century was this development of techniques of close reading, or what the French called explication du texte. And that has carried over into so much film criticism, because you're right, film has its own language, and it too can be read closely. It just demands a slightly different kind of approach, an eye rather than an ear, visual images rather than language. But the finished products can be just as complex, subtle, ambiguous as great works of literature.
Would you say that we can qualify a piece of literature as a great work when it becomes really timeless? I mean, take example of Shakespeare's. His work were known for a particular era, the Elizabeth I in England and all that time, but their themes and the narrative is alive today, while you see sometimes some books that seems to be hot things coming out in that particular moment, then 10 or 15 years later, everybody forgets about it.
Yeah. I guess philosophically, I don't really believe that there's such a thing as greatness that's inherent in any work. I think we begin to call things great when we notice that people have been talking about them for a long time and continue to talk about them and to find it profitable to discuss them. They find new angles as time passes. It creates new perspectives on old texts, and it's very hard to say sometimes which works are going to have that kind of afterlife, you know. And I think I spent a lot of my early career working on 18th century England, and I know there were any number of writers who were thought to be very important at the time, whom we don't read much anymore unless we're scholars of the period. It didn't. It touched the fancy of 18th century people, but they haven't retained their resonance into later eras, you know. So I mean, maybe greatness is a kind of historical accident too. It's something that signals a continuing interest. And then there are works that submerge for a while and reemerge, and people rediscover them, you know.
And I think you're right. Sometimes are things that happen unexpectedly through time. And I guess the case of Moby Dick is a good example of that, because when it was first published, despite the fact that Herman Melville was a well-known author by that time,
it bombed.
The critics just basically destroyed the whole idea. The book was pretty much forgotten. In fact, almost all of the first printing got burned in a storage here somewhere here in New York. And then now has become one of the classics of American literature by far.
Yeah, it's easy enough to understand, I think, the early reaction. It's a very strange book.
Very different.
In many ways, yeah. And yet, sure, it has those qualities of subtlety, complexity, and I mean, it's continued to appeal to later readers in ways that I think those earlier readers could not possibly have imagined, you know.
And talking about films, it actually was the fact that when it was produced as a silent film, the first version with John Barrymore as the main character, that's when people rediscovered the original novel. Yeah. It's funny that somehow Hollywood can help to create this great piece of work.
Yeah, and of course, in truth, it's a really difficult novel to film. You have to leave out huge chunks of what makes the book so strange and interesting. Yeah. Disquisitions about whales and all manner of tangents that he goes off on, you know.
Now, let me ask you maybe a tricky question here. You have also worked on translations.
I have.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. Would you consider that when you're making a film of a book, you're making some kind of a translation?
Yeah, I think that's a metaphor, but it's not an inappropriate metaphor. You know, one could just as easily say that a translation is always in some sense an interpretation. You know, one has to make decisions about what you think the original means. Well, something similar happens when a film is made out of a book. The director chooses to put some things in and leave other things out, like the essays on whales from Moby Dick don't adapt naturally to the cinema. But that's just a very obvious example. And there are a million selections that take place when a book is adapted to the screen. And sure, that's a kind of translation.
And why do you become interested in translations?
Well, I think there are practical reasons. There are things you want to see made available to audiences that don't read the original language. But then beyond that, the whole subject of translation is an interesting theoretical problem. How do you make one work kind of live in another language? It's easy enough to make a literal translation, but to make it sing is something else,
Yeah, because in fact, I mean, sometimes when I have read translation into English of works written in Spanish that I know very well, sometimes I can say, yes, the translator got the idea. And sometimes I say, I cannot recognize this. They have changed the title of the book. Yeah. I would say, okay, that's a different story.
Yeah. Well, we probably all had that experience of reading a translation that just doesn't have a life of its own,
Would you say that probably translation of poetry is probably the most difficult one?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And there are those who would say it can't be done, and probably it can only be done in an approximate way. Mm-hmm. And yet, even there are poets whom I wouldn't know as I do without translations. I have a pretty crude knowledge of German, for example, but I can tell that Rilke is a great poet, and for that I'm in part relying on translations because my German is not that good. But when a poet is that good, it does sometimes come through, even though it can't really be translated. And when the Germans say that, I believe them.
Well, talking about strange things that you mentioned earlier, you wrote about a movie called American Beauty that a lot of people, I don't think, really understood that movie. It was very controversial because it seems that different people have totally different interpretations what it was all about. I hear people saying, oh, that's a horrible movie because it's so unrealistic and so out there. And other people saying, no, that's the reality of the American life. What was your interpretation of that movie?
Well, I wrote a short review of that film, and in many ways I thought it was a very interesting film. I think I said something like it's worth anybody's time. I thought there were things in the film that worked, other things that bordered on cliche, but that what it was trying to do was really, what a lot of works of art have tried to do, I think, in approaching American life, particularly suburban life. And it's easy to be cliched about the suburbs, right? It's a deadening place where people walk around like zombies and so forth. But that's, in a way, setting off the real theme of the film, which is to ask the question, what makes a person's life really come to life? What does it mean to really live fully? And that all the questions that the film asks around the word beauty pertain to that. There are cliched forms of beauty, hackneyed symbols of beauty, like the roses that we see. Some things that are so old that they've lost their ability to evoke the kind of vitality that we want to associate with being alive, right? And yet, the film, I think, found ways to convey that sense too. Some of the acting was dazzlingly good. There were wonderful moments in it, and for those reasons, I did like the film.
Another author on which you have written is Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, and he's one of my favorites because what I call the economy of words, the ability to say a lot of things with few words, which is something that I admire because my own cultural background is not that way. It's the other way around, to use too many words to say a few things. Would you say that you could use Hemingway when you want to tell a student, if you really want to be an economist of words, read Hemingway.
You could. And I think for anyone who's inclined to overdo it with the verbiage, Hemingway can be a tonic shock. I would say that Hemingway's style is it has its own mannerisms, and one can easily drop into a faux Hemingway style in an unprofitable way. You kind of lose yourself in the process of imitating Hemingway because it's so easy to imitate, and very few people can do it as well as Hemingway did, because of course it's not just about the few words he chooses, it's about everything else that's implied, that's there between the words. But Hemingway himself started with some basic rules of thumb for newspaper men. Keep it short, keep it brief, keep it to the point, and developed a style from that, which is a lot more than just terse sentences. It's terse sentences that imply a lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the other piece of work I read that you wrote was about Darwin and Darwinism within the English literature. And I was intrigued by that because he was a scientist.
Sure, yeah.
But still he had some influence, and he also reflected some things going on in his era.
Yeah. Well, that was written coming out of a seminar that we did here at Baruch on Darwin and Darwinism, and people contributed from the standpoint of their different disciplines. And I wrote a piece about Darwin and 19th century English literature in connection with this whole project, which was really very, very interesting to me. I mean, Darwin is so important, but he figures in English literature in several different ways. One as a kind of catastrophe. I mean, there are a whole set of assumptions about the world that many people held dear were threatened by Darwin, and there's one whole body of writing that's just about what it felt like to experience that threat. Autobiographies like Edmund Goss's Father and Son. It's really all about just what happens when a true believer seriously confronts this scientific evidence. Tennyson's In Memoriam, one of the great poetic works to come out of the 19th century, is also, in places, an attempt to grapple, not so much with Darwin, but with his immediate predecessors, the science leading up to Darwin, Charles Lyell, all this information that suggested that the Earth is much older than it had been thought, that lots of things have been changing. So we see that whole 19th century attitude or acceptance of the fact that you can't just study the natural world as if it's permanent and unchanging, that it is mutating. It's a mutable thing, and that fit with a certain 19th century approach to the human and social world, which emphasized the historical dimension. And then you see throughout any number of other writers, I mean, preeminently people like George Eliot, who had read Darwin and were very sympathetic to, a kind of inspiration drawn from the way of thinking that Darwin represented, or even his language, a tendency to import words, like a word like variation, which Darwin was interested in, how the natural world produces variation under the pressure of the environment. So we see things like, well, in the sea there are fish, but there are also mammals who come to resemble fish, and does that resemblance allow you to class them together, or are there differences? Well, George Eliot takes the word variation and applies it to women. She says in the tight environment that women were forced to live in the 19th century, there was not much room for variation. Yeah. And it's clear that the word has an echo that benefits from your knowledge of the scientific usage. So there's a kind of enrichment, of the imaginative literature by the scientific language. So it's very, very rich, complex topic.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Gary Hentzi for this very interesting conversation about literature, English, and many other things. And next week, we're going to have here Dr. Catherine Pence, who will be talking about the story behind history. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.